All right. Hello, everyone. I am Ishita Shah, and in a few minutes, I will introduce myself. But before that, I really want to welcome you all with a lot of joy and excitement to the first talk of this, or the first public dialogue of the series Curating Queer Archives. Um, I think I'm also celebrating the fact that we received interest from so many countries and so many locations beyond the obvious Delhi, Mumbai, Ahmedabad, Bangalore. I think that itself is celebratory enough. I'm not sure if all of you are here. I'm sure some of you have mailed us that you will catch on to the recording or you will join us in the subsequent dialogues. And I think from here on, the tribe should only keep growing. Because there's so much more to explore in this subject together. I must also sort of highlight the fact that we have audience from all walks of life, students or scholars, history or heritage professionals, queer initiative representatives, educators, executive directors. So there is no bar or there is no limit to who all can come together and want to put together queer archive, hopefully for India and then across for South Asia. And so once again, welcoming you all. I'm just going to quickly read out or tell you all in brief about the context behind why the series happened. So we have been putting together Queer Inc., which is now Queer India Archive, for over 16 months. And our own processes or our own explorations and experiences have constantly made us ask some very pertinent questions about the nature of the archive, the process of the archiving itself, and then what does it mean to access and preserve queer histories. And we thought that instead of only keeping it as an internal dialogue or an internal conversation, which is always a small team in these kind of works, how do we have more people participate and help us shape this journey? And instead of calling it, let's say, a launch, we use the platform to really dialogue and discuss about shaping this archive. So that's, and also, yes, of course, I must credit that we sort of get this impetus because in these 16 months, we have been able to grow from one pilot collection to actually having archiving going on across Mumbai, Pune, Delhi, Madhya Pradesh, and participation from the United States of America. Which sort of definitely is something worth crediting, that the contributors have believed in us, and we want to take that forward and have you all join us in this process. The idea behind the speakers, presenters / panelists was only to sort of kickstart the conversation. It's really about few people who might have key experiences or key or primary thoughts about the subject. But what I just described in terms of the demographics of participation, we can tell that you all also have enough experience or questions or thoughts which are going to be important for the dialogue. So while the plan or the curation of the sessions in now, but also in the subsequent dialogues, will be about requesting a few people to take lead. It will always also be about participation across the room, everyone who's present, without any strings attached or without any criteria of what you can say or you cannot. So I'm also repeating myself that we are striving to become as multilingual collective and a group as possible, even in the way we are archiving, and we'll tell you more about it very soon. That applies even to the public dialogue. Repeating, we all, at least 5 of us, are comfortable with Hindi, English, Marathi, Gujarati, Kannada, and Bengali. But I'm sure if there's any other language that you want to bring to the room, there would be somebody else in the room who can help loosely translate it, and we can make sure that everybody is able to engage and participate. Logistics, we have announced it enough that we are recording this conversation. We want more people to be able to access it, be a part of the growing tribe. And hence, if you have any concerns about being recorded, Please use the chat. Don't unmute or switch on your camera. But having said that, those who are comfortable, it would be very nice to see you all before we move forward. So I'm going to stop sharing the screen. My first set of introductions are done. 1 second. It'll be nice to see us all.
Malati, you said something.
Sorry?
You said something, Malati.
Yes, I was just saying that if you can add Telugu as well. We do speak Telugu.
We could add? Sorry?
No, I was saying that in the list of languages, if you can add Telugu as well, because I speak that.
Oh, wonderful. Okay, I'm going to put that list in the chat. Thank you. Yes, we have one more language. Wonderful. Okay, so we are all here. Everybody, hello. Nice to see you all. Okay, and I'm just changing the view so that I can see more people. Sorry, I'm that kind of a person. I mean, I don't want to talk to a black screen, so looking for more faces. Okay, so moving on to, as you all must have read, hopefully it was late in the evening, an email, but otherwise we are first starting with the conversation. So I'm going to introduce our presenters, all of them one after the other, very briefly, and then start speaking about a few things. And then somewhere where we'll get bored of chatting, we'll go back to presentations. We have not put any pressure on anyone to present, but we definitely want to take you all through what the Queering Archives journey has been. And hopefully that that sort of sparks new questions and new conversations, right? So Malati Rao, who just mentioned that she also knows Telugu, has been making documentaries for the last decade, several of which have been broadcast on public television. Handmade in India, on India's craft traditions, and Born Behind Bars, about children growing up in prison, have been awarded and screened at several film festivals. She won Best Woman Director at the Bangkok International Documentary Awards in 2020 for the Gishama is Born. Malati holds a MFA degree in Film and Media Arts from Temple University, USA, and an MA in Mass Communication from Jamia Millia Islamia, Delhi. Thank you, Malati, for joining us. Shobhna S Kumar, an independent queer publisher, continues championing the LGBTQIA community by collaborating on projects centered around storytelling. The publishing venture was launched in 2012 with Out, Stories from the New Queer India. And in 2014, she produced short documentaries. Notably, she has founded the Queer India Archives, an initiative which aims to weave queer histories into the fabric of Indian history, which will encompass oral histories and digitized documents that hold significant value for LGBTQIA LGBTQIA individuals in India. Shobhna's efforts are invaluable in fostering inclusivity and preserving the diverse narratives of the community. Thank you, Shobhna. Siddarth is an archivist turned curator who focuses on epistemic systems and making knowledge accessible. They have a master's degree in literature, linguistics, and civilization studies from the Grenoble Alpes University, France. They have a background in curating cultural and literary spaces and have participated in different community-led human rights movements. After work hours, you can find them cooking up a storm with jazz playing in the background or chasing the rise and decline of ancient civilizations. Pronouns they and them. Thank you, Siddarth. Coming down to a fourth and the last presenter, Srilagna, originally from Calcutta. Srilagna Majumdar is a Hyderabad-based archivist, curator, and cultural history practitioner. With a bachelor's in history and double master's in history and diasporic studies, Srilagna works in the fields of public history, community outreach, and art. Thank you so much for joining us, Srilagna. And very briefly about myself, I am Ishita Shah. I am a interior designer, historian turned curator, and I've worked with different institutions, set up archives, taken archival frameworks into heritage and historical studies, and what I do now is I founded a collective called Curating for Culture. Our larger motto remains culture preservation, and what's very key to us are community engagement and creative collaborations. And where all the other aspects of archiving, curation, they're usually seen through people and through creative practices, which allows us to address issues of representation time and again in different forms of hidden or lesser known histories and narratives. I am also a part of Queer India Archives. I've been the consulting and the lead archivist. So I will keep shifting, like changing my hats through the dialogue. But for now, I'm here on behalf of Curating for Culture. So that's about all of us. And moving on to what our speakers have to say, I have a very fundamental question which I want to start the morning with, which is to ask all of you to sort of share what is your imagination of a queer archive for India, but also for the larger context of South Asia. What is this archive? What is it trying to do? And who and how should it be put together? Whoever wants to begin.
I can start.
Yes, Malati.
I think to me, as a documentary filmmaker with experience in, I wouldn't say I'm an expert, but I have often used resources from communities to create narratives. Often these are narratives which necessarily don't fall into, say, a national narrative. For example, the last film that I made was about Tibetan Buddhist nuns, and this is a community that doesn't have a nation. A lot of their resources were also not coming from any sort of national archives of sorts, but really coming from something that was put together by a community in exile. And so when we wanted, to see what kind of archives they have, they largely came from videos that were shot on cell phones when there were nuns who were trying to escape from China into Tibet occupied China into India. Violence which the community was up against. These were not narratives which you could have found from something which was, from an institutionalized perspective. But yet they told a story which is not easy to either claim as having, say, a political backing or anything. These were really narratives that people themselves had told each other and built through generations, of what they had witnessed. And I feel that a similar situation is, even exists for the queer community in terms of what is seen and unseen. So how do you deal with omissions? How do you deal with stories that don't get told? And I think that's where a queer archive in our country really holds, because that can be the resource of these omissions, of these sort of stories that we don't get told, and I don't mean only stories of violence, but also of success and also of triumph. How do we hold all those stories together so that someone like me who is looking to piece a narrative together or to find instances of stories which exist, which we can say is our history, which we can say is in our collective consciousness, exists. And this can be photographs, this can be videos, everything that comprises of a life experience.
Thank you, Malati, for getting us started and making us see that larger picture. Shobhna, Siddarth, do you guys want to take it up next?
Sure. Hi, everybody. I'm Shobhna. The inspiration, I guess, for me was during COVID times. there was a lot of sort of calls on how to deal with moving back to families, and also people didn't know much about us. I mean, I'm just alluding to the Supreme Court when they said we were a minuscule minority, and so the COVID period actually sort of there was a lot of reflection, self-reflection, in how I work with queering, what we do. The entire existence of queering was about storytelling, but publishing books wasn't enough. We had to sort of look at biographies, autobiographies as well. But that also would have been very much a very alone type of project, working with each writer, empowering them to do this. But then I sort of got a notice about a online course which Ishita was running on curating personal archives. And while I was doing that, that's when the idea came that we need something like this, which is digitally available to everybody in India. Um, Not necessarily just for the queer people who are exploring and looking for others around us, but also for parents, because my learning, my experience in the last 20 odd years while working with this is that even though we have legal change happening or legal uh, sort of saying, privacy rights and all these other things, it's not until the parents actually accept who we are that things will change in society. I think societal norms will change when parents sort of look at their family members who they've not allowed to live their life authentically because they don't know. So my thing in this is basically to let people know, let families know through archives and stories told by the people themselves, their lived experiences, to 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 families in India, basically to figure out, So our like I'm one of the things that I say is we've inherited this injustice. We shouldn't. This generation at least should not allow that to be repeated for the next generation. And I truly believe that. Yeah, and that's how the genesis of the archives came on.
Wonderful. I think both of you have touched upon the political and the social aspect of it. We can move on. Siddarth?
Hello, everybody. Good morning. Mm, how I would approach the question of what a queer archive for South Asia, or just in general, what a queer archive should look like, is in trying to understand what an archive itself is, right? Or what we want this archive or whichever archive we construct to be doing. Um, excuse me. Like archives in the way we know them today exist in two major formats, right? Like you have the physical archive and then you have the digital repository or the digital archive. And there are like the positives and the negatives to both of those formats. When we talk about digital archives, especially when it comes to queer archives, there's the whole conversation to be had about the ethics of onlining certain material and making certain things accessible to the making it accessible in terms that we would understand as open access on the internet. Um, and for the physical archives, the challenges also come in terms of space, because as an archive gets older, the idea is that it grows larger and larger and larger, that more people come to give their material to the archive, that the archive's collections expand. And so one of the major challenges for the physical archive would be like space constraints, making sure that the resources to preserve the material over the following years can take place. So there are some very pragmatic and practical challenges to archiving as well that we have to think of. But to think of maybe in a little bit more of a theoretical or ideological way about what an archive can do. Over the past few years, in the Anthropocene studies, even if the very term Anthropocene is very debated, the people in the Anthropocene studies have been saying that the archive is dead. Right? And what they're saying is that the archive in the traditional format that it was known is now dead. And what we mean by that is that the archive as a colonial force, that the archive with a colonial impetus to classify, to categorize, to understand the other in terms of words that it knows, right? Um, and I'm talking about this because it is very important the kind of language we use to talk about the people who are in the archive. Right? When I usually talk about the archive, I use a frame of three loci, as I call it, which is the archive itself and thus the collections that it has, then the archived, or the people and the lived experiences which are present in the archive, and then the user researcher is the person who ends up using the archive in whatever way possible. So to understand, like, it really helps me understand what the dynamics of an archive can be when I think of these three points around which the relationships then emerge within the archive, right? So who can set up an archive, or who is setting up archives? Again, I think that this question is a little related to what the purpose of the archive is, right? We all know, and I don't really have to repeat that, traditionally queer people have been relegated to the margins of national archives and other institutional archives, where in colonial archives, the queer person very often appeared only as a criminal, especially in the Indian context, where we know of the Criminal Tribes Acts, and then, of course, Section 377. We would see Hijras present in the colonial archive, of course, but only when they were cast in the role of a criminal or in another negative role of sorts, right? Um, so archives, when they are created by minority communities or communities that have hegemonically been denied a lot of power and social presence, then they come as a response to these older, more traditional colonial archives that are based on more divisive structures of power. I think queer archives have the potential to uh, bring different communities together and not really to show that they are different, um, is how I kind of see the space of the queer archive. Um, right? And when we talk about queerness again, this goes back to the conversation we were having, the four of us, the other day, is how do we even define queerness, right? Do we stick to this understanding of queerness only in terms of whether a person identifies as queer? Does that mean that they have to be either born gender or sexually queer? Or is there more to queerness? Who gets to claim the identity queer? What do we mean when we use the term queer beyond just identity, right? We use the term queer to say, let us queer the archive, let us queer methodology, let us queer history. So what does queer there mean? And I think there is a similarity in how we employ queer in that context, and how I think of employing archive as well in certain other contexts. In and what I mean by this is to look at both queerness and archiving as a methodology, and not just as as a noun or as an identity, right? To think of an archive not just as a space that collects historically significant material, but to see what it does with it as well, right? An archive, one of the most important things about an archive is that it not only preserves material in whatever formats, but it preserves the context of production in which these materials were also created. And it is this context that is very important. We need to know where this material is from, what time period it comes from, in whose possession it was before, who were the people involved in creating this object, what life has the object lived before coming into the archive. Queer history can be. Uh, right? The queer history, after having worked in a queer archive for 3 years and with a master's that specializes also in queer history and in Bangalore, to the same question of what is queer history? That's it, very simply. What is queer history and how is the queer history of India being recorded? Or how is the queer history of India being preserved? Exists in so many formats. And I think the queer archive is a space that welcomes all of those formats that sometimes a traditional archive might not welcome either.
Right.
Into paper-based archives. Now we have a lot of digital archives as well. But when you take queer lives and they challenge notions of archiving sometimes, the concept of ephemerality in queer lives, that things might not always be permanent, but it is its fleetingness that makes it more beautiful, that gives it its power. And this notion of ephemerality and the value associated with ephemerality in queer lives kind of contradicts the notion of an archive sometimes, because an archive is meant to endure. It is not meant it is not meant to make something disappear or to let something be forgotten, but it is meant to make things be remembered, which then brings us into the conversation of what should or what can be forgotten in an archive as well. Are we thinking of an archive as a place that only remembers, or are we bringing into the archive the natural concept of forgetting and that of decay as well? And then what happens to our imaginations of queer history or the queer future as well? Because in an archive, time is not so distinct, right? You deal with the past, the present, and the future all in one go. And it is really in understanding how those three come together in the present and in the moment that we're working is how we're setting our archives up right now. Okay, I'm going to stop here for now and we'll come back later.
Thank you, Siddarth. Yeah, I think you did open up a lot of important concepts and questions which need to be pondered over. Maybe we'll take some of them this session, but I can also see them being very relevant to the upcoming sessions of the series. And moving on to Srilagna, if you wanted to take on that question.
Yeah, so I just wanted to add two slightly different points to when do we call an archive? I mean, how do we queer an archive? I think the first step to that, uh, as archivists, is the fact that we should use, while we come to metadata and cataloging, we must use inclusive and affirming language in the archival descriptions, in metadata, in the cataloging practices that accurately represents LGBTQIA identities and experiences, because in a lot of cases we see that the metadata or the cataloging language only caters to the mainstream, and so that is one gap that needs to be bridged. And another point is that I think it's also important, while we are querying the archive, in that sense, with querying within quotes, to remember the concept of intersectionality, and to also bring the other aspects of identity, such as, I mean, race, ethnicity, gender, class, disability, especially disability, which is not highlighted at all within archival practices. So it is very important to incorporate these intersectional analysis, which considers, how the multiple forms of marginalization and privilege, both marginalization and privilege, they intersect and interact within the archive. So yeah, I think these 2 points are uh, not highlighted enough when we come to archiving of any sort, especially when we come to queer archives, because then we are talking about something that has been marginalized for a very, very long time. So yeah, I think these 2 points I would like to start with for now.
Thank you so much. And what you did is you brought us down to the micro, because I think we were talking a lot of meta concepts. And I think it's very important to pinpoint the different activities inside an archive where the change can be made. For all those who might be a little new to these terms or these processes, just hold on for a few more minutes. Hopefully through the presentation, we'll take you through what some of these terminologies mean, and they will still be open for interpretation. We have questions in the chat, but I also I am sort of cognizant of the fact that they would be better answered after the presentation. I want to go to one of the questions which we have received in the Google form while participants were registering. And one of the questions is about challenges faced by LGBTQIA community, students, especially in school, college, universities. And I think while it's a very direct question to the kind of episodes that students might be facing, I'm going to ask all the speakers to sort of broaden that question and talk about how experiences of the current times either would speak to an archive or become a part of such an archive. So somewhere, I think, coming to the present, as Siddarth was saying, that our initial answers or responses are about, we want to look back at the past, we want to connect with the past through an archive. But this question sort of pulls us back into time, in today's times, and asks us, would these conversations or would these experiences either be archived or would they speak anything to the archive? Any one of you wants to take that on? Shobhna, I think we could start with you, because you do speak to a much younger community on quite regular basis. And do you see the fact that you have been sort of putting together an archive now over a few months, does it change or help to understand better what the students or the younger community might be going through, or vice versa?
Interestingly, just recently I started working with the interns from Mumbai University, and they want to see how they can impact students or their colleges, the campus rather, on matters of sexuality and gender. And after much sort of workshopping with them, the consensus there was that they came from an ally's perspective, not necessarily from the queer community members themselves. So it was very interesting, because I've never had allies sort of come so strongly to me and say that I want to do a handbook for students on how to create safe spaces from outside the community. So in that sense, that I think the younger generation are more aware of these issues, see their friends facing it, and also want to have more input or influence on how they can create safe spaces. And again, with the younger generation, I find that whether they be straight or from the communities, is that the history is not known as much. I'm working with 20-year-olds, and they don't know. They don't know the queer history. They don't know same-sex love in India, which is, I think, it's our responsibility to actually make sure that these books are repeatedly set out in the mainstream, that we repeatedly talk about it. Even as a publisher, it's very important that we must always keep talking about who we are, where we came from, and that's only then we'll be able to figure out, what are the lessons learned, and also how to configure or construct for the current scenario. And that learning usually comes from archives or from lived experiences of other people. So in talking to the younger generation, I pull on the resources from the older queer generation, basically, to help them understand about certain aspects of what can be done in India now.
Thank you. Yes, that was a very different answer than perhaps what I'd expected. But good to know that you have such a live example in terms of two works that you are engaged in sort of
Mhm.
coming together, but doing their own bit.
Yeah.
Siddharth, I'm going to come back to you because we haven't spoken about Kamra much yet, but if you want to at this point, tell us a little bit about your experience there. And again, uh, what was the engagement with the contemporary lives and voices while you were setting and building it up?
So I was at Kamra for 3 years, and we always said that Kamra was an archive of contemporary history. Right? Because queer history in India is still relatively quite young. It only picks up in a more structured format beginning in the late 80s, 1980s onwards. And then it only really becomes and spreads across the country into a major network beginning in the 2000s, early 2000s onwards, late 90s and early 2000 onwards. Um, so for us, the history that we are working with and preserving is actually not that very old. And the majority of the people who are in these stories are very much alive. And the people who have given us the material, sorry, Ishita, if you're saying something, I can't hear you.
No, I'm not.
Okay. Um, so the history that we have at Kamra is very, very recent. And most of the people whose lives these stories have happened in are also very much alive. And it is, in fact, some of these people who have given us the consent to have this material. Like Jayashree, over many, many years, has extensively interviewed the different groups of people who were involved in the litigation against Section 377. And she has interviewed lawyers, she has interviewed the different people, queer academics, queer scholars, the team who represented Voices Against 377, lawyers from ALF, right? She has, and that again, while it was happening, was all very much in the present. It was all contemporary. She was documenting this without maybe not thinking that it will end up becoming an archive in the future. And while I think in a more pertinent way to show how we worked with the contemporary voice was also during the conversations around marriage equality in India. As we became a space to bring different people together to have more conversations around it. What does marriage equality truly mean? What are these rights that we are fighting for? Is marriage the best way to get these rights? Right? These were not questions that we as archivists or the archive had, but these were questions that the community around us had. And our engagement with them was to kind of provide space for that community to come. And as an archive, we would provide them a context to the conversation that was happening, right? Where, what is the history of this marriage equality discussion in India? It's not like people woke up one morning and decided, hey, chalo, today let's file a case in the court, right? This is something that would have been planned. This was being discussed. It's part of a larger picture. So trying, I think the archive today, trying to, link with what Shobhna was also saying is that the archive provides the bigger picture for a lot of people who don't know the bigger picture of queer activism in India or the history of queer activism in India. And I, learning about the history of queer activism, I think, is a very good way of learning about what a queer identity in India can also be like. I'm not saying what the Indian queer identity can be like, of course, but what a queer Indian identity could be like. Yeah, that's all I have to say.
Wonderful. Thank you, Siddharth. I'm going to ruminate on all of this in a bit while we come back to talking with each other. In the meanwhile, Srilagna, I think your experience is quite befitting in this question itself. You have worked with the Queer India project. Do you want us to sort of take us through a more personal experience um, and respond to this question?
Yes, I also think this is the right time to also, I mean, do my bit of presentation because it is very relevant to the question that you asked, and it actually, so my all of my experience was significantly with the queer youth, and not so much about the elders. So I would just like to present my screen. I have just noted down a few points for it, making it easier to follow.
Sure. In the meanwhile, a quick reminder to everyone who's listening in, you can send us your questions in the chat. We want to listen to you all as well, or rather change the course of narrative with what you are thinking or concerned about. And in case you don't feel comfortable typing it out, then just raise hand. There is a smiley at the bottom. Actually, not the smiley, sorry. There is a hand button at the bottom. You can use that to tell us that you want to ask something, and we'll come to you.
Yeah. Am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Okay.
Do you want to go full screen?
Yeah, I think that would be better. Yeah, is this all right now?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah. So I worked with the Indian Queer Project. I worked with the Indian Queer Project at during the pandemic period. Basically, I think it was 2020 when I started working with them, and I worked for around a year and a half with them. And during that time, so they claimed to be India's first digital archive devoted exclusively to queer Indian youth. So, and I was also around, I think, 22 at that time. I had just, completed my bachelor's, and it was a good time to connect with queer Indian youth. And you don't really get a very I mean, it's not often that you come across such an opportunity to go heart to heart with your community and queer Indian youth as such. So it was a good, I would say, good experience and very enriching, and which also helped me to discover myself. It actually gave me a scope to I mean, solve a lot of things that were going in my head regarding my own self, regarding my own identity throughout the school life or university life. So it was a very enriching experience, very rewarding experience. And the topics that we broadly discussed, I mean, the phone calls, the interviews went on for like hours sometimes. Although the window was only for 45 minutes, it went on to 2 hours, 3 hours, and it ended up us being very good friends, or just being able to tell those things which we could not tell others. So it was a great way of connecting with the queer Indian youth, which I was not being able to do at the time when I was growing up, when I was an adolescent. So and the topics that we discussed during these interviews um, included dysmorphia, definitely denial I mean, in a lot of levels. Then opinions about gender neutral washrooms, acceptance from parents, uh, the increasing distance with parents, or the coming out experiences if they had come out to their parents. um, then government policies, how they affect our lives, queer health, learning and unlearning and relearning. And a significant chunk of the interview uh, was about school memories, and how we came across so many people who were like us, but who were struggling to talk about these things at that at that point of time, and there was nothing to hold on to, or so there were times when we have felt very lost. There were times when we felt rejected, both in the institution, in the educational institution that we belong to, and at home also. Then we talked about the necessity of pronouns, and it was interesting that there were so many different perspectives, so many different opinions about the same things from within the community as well. So it was interesting. And also, someone said that please stop asking us if we will undergo surgery depending on our pronouns. So basically, we could make a list of the stupid questions that people asked us in our daily lives as queer youths. So yeah, so these were the topics that we covered mostly, and the interviews went on for a long time, and deviating from the prototype questions that were there. So during that time, as the interviewer, as an archivist, as the one who was doing her part in documenting I mean, the condition of queer youth, there were some concerns which came up, and they included marginalization, and difference within the community, which we talked at large. That we at school especially, I mean, most of my interviewees were in high school, and or in the first few years of college, and they did stress upon the fact that they were made to believe that they had to tick some check boxes to make them feel seen or heard, or make them be acknowledged or recognized within the community, which did spark a lot of questions, which I tended to also discuss with my other interviewees. So there were these sections of marginalization, feelings of marginalization and discrepancies within the community itself, which speaks a lot about us. And there was I mean, again, the pressure to conform to a certain notion of queerness that especially in late, I mean, high school and the first few years of college, that you have to adhere to a certain dressing sense. You have to talk in a certain way, walk in a certain way, for people to understand that you're queer, or to empathize with you, or to understand, I mean, to connect with you in general. And there was an interviewee who said that it is so much more confusing to figure out who you are than to know who you are attracted to. So while I'm presenting this, it is inevitable that my own personal experiences and my own stories of self discovery would come in between my work. So I do remember that I do remember, and also I could relate it to so many interviews as well, that from a very young age, when we were in third, fourth standard, we knew that I like this girl, or I like this boy. But it was first few years we felt very eerie about it. Like, what is it happening? Yeah, I'm sure I like this person, but why am I feeling so? I can't talk to anyone about it, let alone home. And then so with that, it takes a lot of time to come to terms with who you are. And then once you come to terms with who you are, then comes the point of the society coming into terms with who you are. Not only the society, even people at home. So getting accepted and acknowledged plays a huge part in the uniformative years of knowing yourself, and also getting accepted beyond your gender or sexuality. So once you have come out, uh, there are instances where every I mean, all our identity depends on our gender or sexuality. So those also pose different kinds of constraints. Then equating gender and identity to one sort of preference, it is not only a preference, I would say. I mean, that's what all the interviewees concluded as well, that it's not just some preference. It is much more than that, and it is something that has to do a lot with, you know, how we present ourselves to the rest of the world. And it was so identity crisis definitely came in, and there is the constant pressure even within the community. There is a constant pressure for the queer youth to identify who you are, to identify your pronouns, to constantly, you know, state that I am this, these are my pronouns, this is my sexuality, these are my sexual preferences. So that leads to a lot of pressure about identifying yourself. And a lot of the people who are in high school, they were still struggling with, you know, discovering themselves, and discovering themselves, and I mean, coming to terms with who they are. So yes, although it is a huge community, sometimes it gets lonely. I should have put this in quotation marks also, because this is something that an interviewee said. And it is actually difficult to imagine how the queer youth lives at home, mm, with their parents who don't really know who they are in a certain sense. And even if they know who they are, there is the constant sense of rejection and the distance that keeps increasing. But still, you can't change yourself, or you can't make your parents sensitized in just a week or a month, or something like that. So there was one interviewee who said that even for this conversation that I'm having with you on phone, I have locked my doors and windows, and I have switched the fan on full speed so that my parents don't hear me what I'm talking about. So to go back to that, the home where, I mean, it also speaks a lot about, you know, private life and public life of the queer youth, and how they present themselves, and the struggles that are imbibed in public and private lives of the queer youth. Um, so I think these are some starting points which can lead to the conversation um, that we might have with the other persons as well.
Srilagna, I really don't mean to interrupt your thought process, but could we keep this a little more brief beyond this point?
Yes, sure. So yeah, so coming back to, you know, what the archives on the lives of queer youth should focus on, of course with due consent, I felt that the queer youth is already missing out on so much. 1 second. Yeah. So the archives should. I remember when I was in school, there were so many love letters or letters in general from close ones, which I had to destroy in because I didn't want them to be seen. So I think archives on the lives of queer youth must definitely incorporate oral history, because that is the starting point. Uh, they can include the different sources of learning about queerness for the queer youth, because a lot of interviewees said that I wish there would have been some, you know, concrete source, instead of me just googling every kind of, you know, every kind of confusion that I have, every kind of directions that I wanted. So it can also be a repository of the coming out experiences, which can be a source of inspiration, I might say, or, you know, just pave a way for coming out in general. There can be images of documenting the lives of queer youth, including the photos of everyday life, protest celebrations there, which we were also talking about a little while ago, I think, that there are stories of success as well. So the visual representations of those things, videos, audio recordings, multimedia presentations capturing the performances, because in India, the queer youth, I think it's very inspiring for every one of us, the way in universities and high schools, breaking off from their institutional engagement, they are organizing so many, you know, performances, speeches, reading sessions, which are significant events that involves our lives. Definitely an archive has its responsibility in curating the educational resources, educational programs, the outreach materials which can raise awareness and promote understanding of queer youth issues within the community and beyond. And the last point, I would like to keep it short, that objects are. It's very interesting how our generation is trying to spread awareness and promote understanding by, I mean, doing our bit, like doodling something, clothing, badges, posters, flyers. It's very interesting, the different ways in which we are trying to reach out and reach out to our own community, and also creating a certain kind of connectedness within the community. I think that is all for now. And the rest of the things that I will want to share, I would share along with the questions.
Okay. Thank you, Srilagna. And again, sorry that I had to interrupt.
No, it's okay.
It's just that we want to hold the room together also. So while I think all the points that you made were very relevant in terms of your first-hand experience, and I was just noting down, it brings us to, it sort of reminds us that there are these very basic notions and questions when it comes to an archiving project or an archive speaking to the contemporary audiences. And I think I'm going back to what Siddarth said, that the history itself is very contemporary. So, Malati, we still have to hear you out, because you are sort of one of those speakers who would be taking such content, even if not directly right now queer histories, but histories which are lesser known, narratives which are lesser understood or studied or talked about. When you take it to different audiences, what has your experience been like? And at this point, I also want to sort of club the very pertinent question that Garfield has put out, that there is this one generation who is neither old, neither young, and they also have stories to tell, and perhaps their stories are not even being heard yet. I mean, still not yet. So where does an archiving project position itself? Do we always have to wait for something to become old enough and only then interpret it for a larger audience? Malti?
I missed the last part of what you said, Ishita. After you,
Okay.
After
so I just said, how do you? What did I say? Yeah, I mean, how does an archiving project position itself when it comes to histories which are not so old? And do we really wait for them to become quote unquote old enough before they can be they're seen valuable enough to be preserved, archived, and then made available for interpretation? I think, being a devil's advocate, should I even say, does it need to be an archiving project, or are we talking of alternative methodologies here?
Yeah, thanks for bringing that up. But before I, sort of talk about my own observations on it, I really wanted to, thank both Siddarth as well as Srilagna for bringing up two beautiful ideas. I mean, there were several, but Siddarth, the ephemerality of queer lives and, the question of archives within that is such a fascinating idea. It really gives you a lot to think about. And also with Srilagna, I felt that, love letters that you mentioned, I mean, they're both the ephemerality as well as the love letters are such a romantic idea. And to me, really looking at archiving from a place of lived experiences and not from, a place where feelings don't matter. And it's just a sort of a documentation. It gives it gives the idea of archiving so much more richness in that sense and meaning. And I think for me, that's also a segue into some of the work that Shobhna and I have been involved with in terms of the documentary process. One of the things that has interested us in looking at is, like you mentioned, Siddarth, that since this has really been, archiving of queer lives has largely been a contemporary idea. We also were interested in looking at um, where could we get a sense of queer lives when documentation, even before the digital era began. And one of the resources we looked at was letters that came to Bombay Dost, for example. And we really found some very valuable and touching responses there, which for a documentary filmmaker, I'm grappling with how to bring those into the conversation. Because one of our challenges is to see how there are narratives that exist, and then how do you create parallel narratives within it. And so, Bombay Dost, with the letters that came in, understanding of the times that these were written, is really giving us a sense of what, say, where a lot of cloistered sort of lives were finding outlets. And this was one of them. So, for example, I recollect one of the letters bringing up how in, someone, a reader bringing up Bombay Dost as a magazine that they came across, and then said, for the first time, I'm reading about other lives which reflect mine. And I haven't met a single gay man in Madras. And the editor writes back saying, I've received 8 letters from Madras, so don't worry, help is near. So those are some of the stories which I think we would like to bring into the documentary as an example of what existed, what were the pockets that existed. And I'm, again, not trying to be polemical here, but I do think that there is an existing narrative, and then within it, how are we creating parallel narratives is something which, to me, brings in complexity. The other part which I wanted to also bring up as someone who has looked at archives is, what is the place for oral histories? And this may be a place where archive and, especially contemporary archive and documentary might intersect. Because to a large extent, if you look at lived experiences, oral history, and to your point, Srilagna, about who has not been asked so far, whether it is barriers of caste or class or gender, which has prevented these questions to be asked to communities. To a large extent, documentaries really look at bringing those stories to light. And these are stories which necessarily don't get, the same importance, the same sort of pride of place or a seat on the table. And so for us as documentary filmmakers, those oral histories are often the basis of what we build on, right? So is that archive or is that a documentary? And I think, like, was mentioned earlier about the queer archives, especially in Bangalore, a large part of it is Jayashree's work, which are all documentaries. So, that fine line is all I want to kind of bring to your attention here. The third point that I wanted to also bring up is that, to me, the beauty of having an archive, whether it is a digital archive within the zone of digital humanities, or whether it is a physical archive, the beauty to me is that it gives anyone who is engaging with it an opportunity to interpret the material. And I understand that that comes with complexity because, once you have material, how people interpret it can be very open-ended. But to me, I think that is also of value. The way in which interpretation can happen is also an ongoing discussion. You could argue with it, and you could have, say, problems with how it may be done. But at the same time, I think it forwards narratives to your advantage or disadvantage, and one can respond to it. I'll give you an example of something which has been constructive. Again, reverting not so much to the documentary that Shobhna and I are doing, but to a previous project. There was a lot of discussion about how the Buddhist community has always been in favor of including the nuns in discussions. And they had documented a lot of the conferences. Now, from their perspective, they had documented a conference which talks about how women should enter the echelons of power and education, etc. But what they didn't highlight was just a small, almost like a 3-minute part where one of the nuns stood up and protested and said, "This is how I see how you are reading the traditional texts. Now, you have said that if women enter, and some of the texts have said if women enter this level of education, then Buddhism will be destroyed in 500 years. That has not happened." And she really pushed forward her point. Now, that was not part of what the conference was interested in highlighting, but it was a small segment. It is up to us, as someone who's viewing the archives, to see how they can reinterpret that material. So I think something that I feel is that there are several gatekeepers even to archives. And to me, that is problematic. Because I think archives should be something which are open to all, to be able to review it, to see it, to use it, and to bring in complexity. So, however we sort of build the archives, I think the gatekeeping is something which, to a large extent, we need to be wary of. That's all I wanted to say.
Thank you, Malati. These were some very fascinating points and observations that you sort of listed out for us. Some responding to what the speakers have said, something which opens up room for new conversations. Hopefully, also positions what you have said and also what Srilagna said, sort of positions the presentation that I'm about to make. But before that, I want to just quickly check if Siddarth and Shobhna, either of you have any last set of responses or remarks to what has been spoken about until now, especially to Garfield's question, which we connected along with the question of the youth. Anything that you guys want to add?
Nothing right now. Maybe later when we come back to it.
Okay. Shobhna, I think you're saying the same thing?
Yeah.
Okay.
Later, yeah.
Okay, so with everyone's permission, I'm going to shift the gears a little bit and take you all into the context of where we all come from and present to you what we have been doing. While I'm setting the screen share, a quick disclaimer. I think it's there in the email as well. We are all very new at this, and we are all exploring. So I'm not saying this to sort of be emancipated or anything like that. I'm saying this so that you all can see the presentation with that lens and sort of, we're really looking for people to join hands, whether it's contributions, whether it is volunteering, whether it's just about spreading the word. And if you could sort of hear us out with that intention would be very helpful. And we really want to know what kind of questions and comments come to your mind. In the meanwhile, I also remembered one very basic question, which I think, Srilagna, you could answer. Ansh has asked, who started Queer India project? Because I think we could finish that before we look at this presentation.
Yeah, so the Indian Queer Project was started by Divya David and Ria and Rigo. They both are co-founders of the project, and they used to. So they also work in another project called the Indian Women Project, where they show and document and interview women from marginalized communities, Dalit women, and women from occupational backgrounds which we do not highlight in archives in general. So that is their major work, and I think they have, for some reason, they have discontinued their work on the Indian Queer Project. But yeah, those two are the people who started it.
Great, thank you so much. Okay, Queer Ink Archives is how we started, 1st of February 2023, with a very simple intention, weaving queer histories into the mainstream Indian history. And it's been a collaboration between two organizations or collectives. And I think any of these conversations now, at least which are about a collective, should start with its people. And so the idea obviously belongs to a person. Here's a quick short vision note or sort of heartfelt intent note from Shobhna, which also keeps reiterating. You can read more on the website. But that's, and I think Shobhna did cover it in her earlier answer as well. So Queer Ink Archives and now Queer India Archives sort of is Shobhna's brainchild and a response or a reflection during the COVID times. But then it needed sort of a group of people to come together, sort of believe in it and strategize and put together what we would do. So here we were, 4 of us, and then a very important role. We all know, I think, the first set of research associates and assistants play when we have these very larger than life ideas. So that's Shobhna, Malati, Ishita, Sapna came together, and Sukhada, who joined us as the 5th wheel and steered the way through. Who we are now, we have a team growing this summer, especially because we have projects growing in different parts of the country, as I mentioned earlier, including our first summer internship program in collaboration with Ashoka University has given us younger force and younger minds on board. Where it also began is when somebody sort of believes in the idea as a contributor and is sharing their life and their life belongings with you. And that would be Ashok Rao Kavi, who sort of openly welcomed the idea, and his collections and his oral histories became the pilot project of a lot that we have done and we'll be talking about for a few months, which has also led to what we will be doing with the other collections. So yeah, credits to Ashok for that. Vision, mission, very straightforward. I think what's more important over here to highlight is the idea of collective responsibility, which has been in core from day one, that we will not be able to, or we will not want to pull it off all by ourselves or make it all about ourselves. The idea of queer community is embedded in the idea of a community, and that community or the idea of community-led archives is what needs to sort of drive this project further on. So I'll take you towards that through the presentation. And who we are now, in terms of contributors, we have OS Muhammad Khan, Professor Raj Rao, Ruth Vanita on board. We are also building collections with Anjali Gopalan and James at NAS Foundation, NAS India Foundation, Bindu Madhav Khire in Pune, and Maya Shankar, who is helping us put together the Sangeeni Trust collections. Processes that we have followed so far started somewhere. I think it's a pet peeve of a historian to talk frameworks, but I think more for this project to understand, is it only about people and their lives, or is there more to curating and building this archive? And it was very interesting because very early on, the kind of works that Ashok has done, there's Humsafar Trust, there's Bombay Dost, all of which are his, again, brainchild, and they are part of his life, but they are separate also. So where would we position it? Do they become a part of his history only, or does it have its own identity on the archiving platform? And these questions led us to constantly thinking of more collections or more ways to identify collections that will structure the archive. And I think we are now very clear that Bombay Dost will be a collection of its own. And that is where all the archival tools in terms of keywords and metadata mapping would allow us to continue keeping it a part of Ashok's life, but also letting Bombay Dost be an individual entity, allowing it to sort of credit all those other members who have been a part of Bombay Dost. And same thing would happen when we archive the collections of Kashish Film Festival. It's also important at this point to bring back, or reiterate the point which Siddarth made, is the livingness of many of these projects, because Kashish Festival, for example, has lived many lives and many different ownerships. So it will be very important to sort of allow that to be seen and understood as a historiography. And that is why it remains an entity by itself and doesn't become a sub-collection of any one person. Three important tracks that we have sort of laid out for ourselves: oral history and interviews, physical archiving, and extended documentation. I'm not going into each sub-point. You all can read this up, or you will get to see it in the subsequent slides. But I think the important part here, why oral histories come first, was to understand the lived histories was sort of quintessential, before which one could have not made sense of so much of physical archives or belongings that come forth, right? Perhaps also because it's otherwise just a notebook or a diary. And the fact that the lens of somebody's queer experiences redefines the collection and its description and cataloging is very much related to what Srilagna was saying, that what might change is not the archiving process, but the micro elements, or how you enter data into that cataloging sheet. So it was very important to sort of speak to and hear the stories. And also, of course, I mean, simply put, they are all around, and why not hear it from them rather than have somebody else talk about their collections later on, which has been sort of a problem with many archives of the past, that somebody else is speaking on behalf of somebody. Now, while that's important, when you don't have the person around, there are issues of representation which come up. Extended documentation became very critical because not everybody is ready for these very modern recent histories to be archived. So not everything is preserved. Archiving itself is a matter of resource and certain sense of privilege. Again, everybody might not have it. And hence, when you find these missing gaps, it was important to sort of fill them up in the most creative ways. The second reason being that everyone's lives are not located in one city, one building, one place. So if materials were in some other venue or a place, would the archive do that extended work of pulling out the resource or making a copy and complete the narrative on this end as much as possible? With the disclaimer that there's never 100% complete archive, but still trying your best. So this is what our oral history recordings have started to look like. We have been working both with online and on-site formats. which also means capacity building to another level for senior members to get used to the online platforms, or vice versa, getting used to the devices right in front of them, and then speaking a lot about what might have been difficult memories. But all in all, yes, Ashok's conversations are over 20 hours long, and very diverse kinds of narratives and histories that it sort of connects and still leaves it open for more research, actually. Professor Raj Rao's archiving, oral history archiving is sort of complete. It was 4 sessions long, but spread across 2 locations, and starts speaking a lot about places he inhabits and lifestyle that he prefers. So oral histories also start opening up those layers. Whereas with Owais Muhammad Khan, it was fascinating to see that he sort of started governing what phase 1 became, which is a lot more focused on his personal life, personal narrative, and his belief systems, and which he thinks is sort of a precursor to understanding his professional journey, which will become phase 2 of the oral history archives. Oral histories also sort of find a new form inside the interviewers' mapping notes, and which I think are equally important to an archival project. But on the other hand, going through the basic cataloging structure and adding subject keywords, research keywords, so that oral histories are more accessible, and not hours long of material to skim through. Thanks to our interns, we are moving forward on this next step. Simultaneously, we have been transcribing, which I think is a very important aspect of reproducing archives. And that's simply because one is acknowledging the fact that not everybody has similar abilities. I won't want to use the word disability. So somebody is uncomfortable listening to something for hours, they can read through, and vice versa. But the audios also will be edited and sort of clipped into smaller segments, which makes it easier to even skim through the audio content. On the in the next track, we have physical archiving, a quick glimpse of the diverse materials that we have come across, from newspaper articles to magazine articles, reports, documents, letters, publications, which are quite rare, photographs, a lot of digital data as well, because these are late 80s and 90s. The computer has already made headway. But on the other hand, what Malati remarked is very important, that there is Bombay Dost, which tells that, okay, even though maybe the digital was there, there was this need to send things handwritten or analog, which I think allowed more anonymity. This is my interpretation, of course. And very recent sort of view or sneak peek speaks into the other collection. So what the collections in Pune looks like, and while in Delhi, everywhere we have found artworks also, we have found consultation, we have found helpline material, and yeah, and a lot of photographs, and all of this material comes with the concern about whom do we want to identify, whom do we not want to identify, do we have the rights? And that's where the process goes a little back and forth. Very important to highlight that we found material in more languages. So there is Hindi, Marathi, English so far, and we're excited to keep discovering more vernacular content. And the same way as we spoke about oral histories, physical archives have been going through cataloging sheets and record management way before I think somebody must have done it for oral histories, simply to obviously quantify, but also assess the material, assess both in terms of conditions and in terms of rights. But largely all of this becomes a meticulous record, which then allows you to do easy digital access, create easy digital and searchable databases. Preservation. So while our primary focus has been digital archiving, I think it's very difficult to let go of the care for physical archives, because we all understand, and I think more and more it's getting clearer that the tactility, the materiality of an archive is going to always be important, how much ever digital archiving sort of might have its own pros in terms of access and outreach. But also one is cognizant of the fact that archiving is very resource intensive, and hence what are the easiest available next door kind of solutions that we could work with. And that's the collection being archived by Sukhada at Ashok's place and then eventually at her place. The form of preservation, yes, high resolution digitization, but also creating low resolution formats so that it can be made available on a website. And this whole spectrum it's in itself such an important process, and finding the right people who understand what our requirements are. Very happy to say such companies are increasing in the country slowly, but still not so many. So that's credits to Pujasoft team, who has really understood our requirements. Also the fact that I must highlight that unlike an institutional archive, where it might be easier to do such a collaboration and put down a cost-effective proposal, we are a very small archive in quantity, right? And still, there was the interest from Pujasoft as a company to say, yeah, but this collection seemed very important, and these are histories which have really not been talked about. I think, again, connecting it back to Shobhna's point, that there are many more allies now who understand the importance of bringing out hidden histories or unseen histories. And that makes such projects very exciting and very promising. This is what extended documentation has looked like. We really walked through and two places of Ashok's growing up years, from his different houses that he's lived in. And there was such interesting paradox that he sort of reiterates, but also brings them out. It also reminds him of stories which might have not got covered in the oral history, in the main oral history sessions. And a lot has changed. So what is also happening in these kind of efforts is it is addressing change of histories and narratives in other segments, whether it is cities, whether it is business histories, whether it is politics. So queer histories are not just about queerness or about gender and sexuality. It definitely opens up Pandora box, actually, in terms of so much of other transformations that have happened much faster in the recent years, even though these are very young histories, if I might call it, or contemporary, as Siddarth called them, but they still have a lot many more layers. And then, of course, the other end of extended documentation has been to look at the people or the places that every interviewee talks about, and finding their contacts and reaching out to them. So those smaller interviews of people who are associated with the main collection sort of starts plugging in the missing gaps, or sometimes gives a contrasting view of what the interviewee might have said. And I think that's very important for an archive to constantly remind themselves and execute it, that it's not about just listening to one side of the story or one perspective, but to constantly put together as many different voices as possible. So final bit, what are the possibilities that we see on from here? Would be a digital archive. There would be one which could be based on provenance of the archives. But in this case, as we all know that the people are around and the organizations are around, why look for a provenance-based approach? It's more exciting, or it's more appropriate to make collections based on people, organizations, and initiatives, as I was mentioning earlier. And then a very simple structure that usually archives follow. The last detail of every thread is going to be the archival material itself. And we work on the metadata thread such that it connects you to the main collection, but it also connects you to related subject and keywords across different collections and archives. And that is what will make very exciting research possible, or very pertinent research possible through such an archive. There's no cost to dreaming big, and because we have been also invested in looking after the physical archives, we definitely don't want them to be lost, or, or misplaced or any other way. And what if a resource center could be imagined where eventually all these histories and archival collections could come together? And they do exist, and more have been now coming up in the country. So the dream doesn't seem impractical anymore, which will also allow better care, better relatability in terms of the archival collections and other reading materials, and possibility of exhibitions or other forms of dissemination. And that brings me to the final idea of dissemination, beyond just research and scholarship, because I think one of the things usually we have faced, not so much now, I think in the recent years, but this this prehistoric notion that archives are for research only, or are for research and scholarship only. And I think that's really old and dated. Archives can be used for many more things, or many more ways, or creative ways, collective ways. So what you see, the image at the back is an exhibition poster at the Festival of Libraries hosted by Ministry of Culture, which happened last year. And I think a lot of people found it fascinating to know that such an archive could exist, and we were able to show Bombay those collections there. And it just opened up the subject for them. So it was not something very scholarly. It was just giving everybody a glimpse into the stories of Bombay Ghost. What you see on the left is a social media campaign, or an initiative started to collect more memories about Bombay Dost. And Shobhna has been receiving endless interest, or responses for this, and not necessarily timed, that it only happens on a certain day or a certain month. You keep these channels open, and whether these become a part of the archive or not is perhaps for the next mandate. And then Malati did speak briefly about the film that Shobhna and Malati are sort of putting together. That's, of course, documentaries, films, books, exhibitions, just public engagements. Even right now, what we all are doing is happening because we have envisioned an archiving project together. So there's so much that can happen out of bringing histories together. Coming to the main point, I think, which I started with, that while all of this has been happening with a few collections, the larger interest was that it cannot and it should not be a one-person role or a one organization role. Queerness, or queer history, and even queer present times is all about community and the sense of community. And it should be growing, as we have all remarked in different ways. It's not just about being queer, it's about allies, it's about figuring out yourself, everybody coming together and wanting to still put these stories, histories, and narratives together. And hence, our approach has been to constantly think of creating tools, frameworks, which can be easily understood, but also easily adapted. So we are not stuck on the idea that it has to happen one way. I remember recently also telling one of the interns that what is fascinating is each collaborator or contributor to the archive has been guiding the process in their own way. And we have also been learning with them, from them. So here are all of us in different cities doing it differently based on what the resources available are, what the stories are, and using the online as judiciously as possible to strengthen these relationships and build capacities across towns and cities. With that, I end my presentation. I invite you all to celebrate something that we have convinced ourselves and decided to do, because a lot of readers or writers who wrote to us made this mistake. They wrote QIA as Queer India Archives, and we saw that as very relevant, and we also knew somewhere that we were looking at Queer India Archives as an eventual identity. So yes, as of 1st of June, we are now going to identify this project as Queer India Archives and not just Queer Inc. But Queer Inc. will always be the parent body who has made all of this possible. If you're still not following us on social media, right now we're only on Instagram. Do follow us there. With your permission, I will also want to add you all to our emailer list. You can unsubscribe if you think things are not relevant anymore. And stay in touch, join hands, tell us more about how you want to contribute to this project. Thank you.
Thank you, Ishita. That's amazing. And the actual project started with my just having an idea and trusting two people, Malti and Ishita, to help me figure out. And also, the interesting part is that Ishita, Malti, and I generally have very opposing views of how things should be done. And it's in those conversations, I think, we have come to this point. Thank you both.
Thank you, Shobhna. I think contrasting opinions are very healthy for building archives.
Yeah.
Building
For
history.
example, one of my contrasting opinion is I don't know what to make of the map that you have up on the main, the first thing. It's got India and then it has got other countries, part of the South Asia imagination, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, in fact, I'm glad that you are asking this, because one of the questions I definitely wanted us to ponder over before we close, I think even it's in the chat. I know we should have thought about South Asian speakers, and we'll get there, but I definitely felt that we should speak about it. We should start speaking about it. And I want to read out that question. Give me 1 second. Where is it? Sachin has asked, I would like a response from the expert panel on what framework we use in defining the queer with reference to South Asia in general and India in particular, so that the process of archiving the lived experiences is inclusive. And I think, yes, over here we are expanding or pushing ourselves to expand the idea of inclusivity, to connect, to use archiving as a way to connect with folks, families, friends of neighboring countries, neighboring regions, and yeah, somewhere disregard the political boundaries. So you are asking me, but I think for me, this is more of a question for you all, or anyone in the audience wants to take a shot at it. But we do need to start talking about queer archives as a larger region, is where we came from, and hence the map.
Mm-hmm. Well, the thing is that India doesn't exist in isolation. So the subcontinent does play a part in who we are. So at this point, I think we start with this. And in my head, it was, we'll be South Asian as well. But that will also come with collaborations, because, we need many more partners, collaborators to make this happen.
I'd just like to add that there are archiving efforts happening in other South Asian countries, queer archiving efforts specifically as well. Bangladesh is seeing some, Sri Lanka is seeing some, Indonesia is seeing some. So queer archiving is not, as spread out across South Asia as one would like or one would want. But it is beginning, and I think it will only keep growing. We've seen in India that, we've been at an archival turn, to use that expression, where suddenly the archives have boomed. More people are interested in the archival field than before. The possibility of the space of the archive and its contents, their interpretation, their reinterpretation, all of that has only increased. Right? And so what brings queers together could eventually also become the archive. We had the movement bring us together for such a long time. And after the first significant victory, which was Navtej in India, then we had, the first significant victory was actually Nalsa in 2014. Then we get Navtej in 2018. So we have Nalsa and then we have Navtej. And whatever is happening with marriage equality, let's set that aside. But, like across South Asia, we have had a history of similar kinds of colonial forces, which have brought about a similar legal context. We see in Singapore a very similar law to Section 377 because of the British. Pakistan has very similar laws as well. Bangladesh has similar laws as well. But I think there is also a cultural continuity across South Asia. The identity of who we know as the Koti, the feminine gay man, is not just that, but becomes a bastion for gender non-conforming identities, and is, the term Koti in different ways is recognized in Thailand and in other Southeast Asian countries as well. So I think I would say the framework we use to talk about queerness in South Asia should be one that foregrounds the South Asian queer experience and doesn't necessarily compare and contrast, right? A lot of sexuality studies, when they talk about sexualities in the Occident versus the West, they always make a point to compare and talk about what are the differences between the two. Does being gay in the US mean the same as being gay in India? And for a long time, the traditional answer was no, it does not mean the same thing, because you're in a third world country in India. You have many more layers of marginalization, that this. As much as we all agree with it, there is also, we have so many different types of queer, but being queer can be our unifying framework itself, right? What does it mean to queer? What is it to be queer? These are questions that will help us think of the archive, but also of the community, I feel.
Malti, do you want to respond to any of these?
No, I'm in agreement. I think to a large extent with what Siddarth is saying, and I do think though that there's a lot to be said about um, how we sort of look at the South Asian identity as such, because I mean, one, to see what is the kind of archiving effort that is going on there. And second, also, I feel in terms of the map, to some extent, I also felt that it was providing a sort of unity which sometimes may also not entirely be known to us, entirely true, and falls into a sort of a political zone of, seeing the Akhand Bharat. So that's what I was pointing out.
Yes. Fair enough. Yeah,
Where does that map come from?
Oh, right now, the answer is much simpler. It comes from Google, and it comes from which one was easy to use for a creative. I think somewhere, at least I speak for myself, I do feel sometimes it's okay to not theorize when you're doing creative visualization. I might be sort of giving you all an excuse, but yeah, these become some of the concerns when we are trying to take these very culturally rooted, historically important narratives, and then work with, as I said earlier about curating for culture, we work with creative interpretation and representation. And I think there might be a lapse, and there might be something lost. But if that triggers new conversations, you're like, okay, it's in good faith. Coming back to, I think this conversation and hinging myself onto what Siddarth highlighted, the idea that there are similarities and dissimilarities in belonging to a certain geographical side or a setup is exactly why we feel that it needs to be a more coordinated effort, not at all to club or create a club or group anybody or to sideline, but it's just in terms of learning and exploration, given that we have been working with South Asian partners now for over 4 or 5 years, we have realized at Curating for Culture that there is a lot of merit in learning and exploring certain avenues next door rather than constantly looking at. And of course, I think most of us agree we do want to subvert or decolonize the Western model. So, and the coordinated effort, which Shobhna spoke about, is quite in tandem with what we said. We want it to be a community-led and community-based project. And in that situation, there might be resources that we might need from efforts in Sri Lanka versus somebody in Bangladesh or Pakistan might need some materials from us. And if the digital has made that possible to at least exchange and learn from each other, we want to grab the opportunity. And if there are differences, yes, we create our own models and setups. So that's right now the shorter answer. Hopefully this series will unpack this question about queer for South Asia and India, and queer in archives over the next and subsequent sessions. I don't think we have time for all the questions, but it's so exciting that all of you were listening, engaged. We might write back to you. I just want to answer for us one question, which was about ancient scriptures. That's from Aishwarya. If the concept of queerness was present in our ancient scriptures, I would love to know any mentions or practices. Aishwarya, I'm right now going to answer this in the shortest way. Oral history collection or recording of Ashok Rao Kavi is full of this material. He's researched so much. He's also got some of these books in his collection. We are still not public as far as the collections are concerned, but if you do write to us, we'll figure out a temporary way for you to be able to study and access these materials and answer your questions. Shortest answer, yes, there is a lot about queerness in ancient scriptures across different religions and ethnicities in one or the other way. And hence, one would need to go through the scholars and the interviewees who have interpreted it. And then, of course, you might build your own interpretations.
There is also Rutvanita and Salim Kidwai's wonderful book, Same-Sex Love in India, which was published in 2000. And this is a collection of different scriptures going back to ancient India as well as, more contemporary ones. There's also lots of Urdu poetry in there and Urdu texts that they reference. So if you want to learn more about Indian scriptures of across cultures that mention queerness, I think Rutvanita and Salim Kidwai's book would be a wonderful place to begin.
And also that we also have Rutvanita as part of our.
Yes.
So some of her work would also include this. So it would be part of the art.
And I don't know if I should be saying this so early on a recorded conversation, but yes, I'm looking forward to recording and exploring that part of Ruth's work very soon. So again, keep a watch out on our updates. As soon as her oral history is completed in a few weeks or months, which is the plan, we will have more of that content coming in. In fact, now that we're saying this, I also realized Owais Khan has also mentioned his understanding of scriptural mentions, and especially from the context of different religions, what it means to interpret queerness in India. Yes, Shobhna.
Yeah, I just wanted to respond to Sachin's question of, cutting in there. Does literature and cinema find any space in the process of developing queer archives, which is where literature comes in? So we have not focused on literature and cinema per se in this archive. This is basically oral histories and digitizing. There is another archive being collated on queer Indian literature. At the moment, there's less than 1,000 books. So it will be probably a lot quicker in coming. But that's a listing of the thought behind it is that we'll list the books and then hopefully talk to the authors who are alive right now on those books and try to get some idea of what they wrote, why they wrote at that point in time. So that's the idea behind the literature archive. Cinema we've not touched. I'm not sure I'm qualified for it or even to work on it, but any collaboration is welcome. The other thing I think Garfield mentioned was the older generation, the pre-internet days. We are in contact with several. We must remember that in the older generation, a lot of people are married. A lot of gay people are married. So they do not want to come out. They do not want to be on record. And that's one of the things we are trying to figure out, how to bring their stories in the mainstream as closeted people if possible. But that itself has to do with permissions and, legalities, families knowing, even perceptions of where they're from. If, for example, if they describe a local coffee shop or something, the family, if whatever they read, might know. So that type of knowledge is also, we need to sort of figure out how to do all this. So that's a very, in terms of ongoing conversation at the moment. But we are acknowledging we do have the older generation in mind. A lot of them don't want to give us their stories or to be publicized, actually. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think that leaves us with the elephant in the room, which we haven't addressed, but I don't think day one could have been about it, is the whole idea of ethics of documentation, which is a question from the Google form. We all were also internally talking about the role of preserving anonymity or identity or privacy, which is going to be very critical to building queer archives. And hopefully we'll come up to these questions very soon in the next set of sessions. I think the only other question, I think Garfield, your earlier questions have been answered. One which I thought was very interesting is there a timeline? And I agree with you. Yes, we do put down timeline, and we said, okay, we wanted to close Ashok's collection in a year, and then we found phase 2 of materials. But yes, we do want to close collections to a certain extent and be able to say, okay, let's make this much public so that it doesn't become a never-ending project. However, the larger project of building such an archive is going to be years-long effort, and not many more people coming on board, resources coming on board, and then we will see the volume put together. So time over here is going to play very different roles. The questions which we are not able to answer, either I can say that hope you will come back and listen to us, but definitely don't want to eat in on a Sunday afternoon with another few minutes either. And or if we will share these questions with the presenters and sort of share your email addresses, they might write back to you all if at all there is a response that they feel is urgent and immediate. Otherwise, I do feel many of these questions will get sort of churned in the coming sessions, public dialogue. So stay tuned, keep joining us, and keep bringing friends and family, especially family and friends who need to be convinced, or who need to hear this. Bring them along, and we'll try and make it as engaging as possible for everyone. With that, I'm going to call this first public dialogue a close, and it's been super exciting at my end. I hope all the comments which are coming in, it has been exciting for you all to listen in as well. Thank you for all the love and the claps. Thank you, Malati, Shobhna, Siddarth, and Srilagna. You really got us kick started, as I said in the email yesterday, and that really matters. I know there are going to be many more occasions and conversations, but the first one is always special. Thank you so much, and I hope that for you all as well, it was enriching an experience.
An absolute pleasure to have been here today.
Thank you so much, Ishita.
And before everyone leaves, if everyone wanted to just switch on their camera and we can take a group shot on these Google Meet things these days. We do now group photos with profile pictures and mugshots. And of course, I did recognize the team in my slides, but some of them are here. All of them are here. Sukhada, Rashi, Sanika, Maliye, and Jigisha, our new young team is all here. But I'm sure you all are team as well with all the amazing work that you all are doing. So claps to all of us together. All right. Thank you, and have a wonderful Sunday ahead.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Bye. Thank you so much. Bye. Bye.
Done?
Yes.
Okay.
I think Zoha,
Okay.
Vishakha, and Shripurna, do you have anything else? I should stop recording, by the way.
Okay, bye. I'll talk to you later.
Yes, yes. See you. Bye-bye.